Last week I spoke about someone whose childhood experiences that seemed to be at the core of everything that went wrong in her life, all of her symptoms, all the things that brought her into therapy, was not trivial. Certainly very painful for the young child going through it, but not something that we would think of as traumatic or very serious. Certainly not something that we might consider abuse. Today I want to talk about someone who did go through some really horrific things. And I want to use this as an example of uncovering lies. The book that I wrote is called Stop Lying. Lying is a strong word, and I want to emphasize again, I'm not talking about conscious lies. I'm not talking about anybody being a liar. But the unconscious lying that we all engage in, some of us to a greater degree than others, it's a useful way of understanding how things go wrong in our lives, how we develop the kinds of problems that bring us into psychotherapy, and the kind of problems that mess up our lives long before we go to therapy. Now, this is a case that on the surface might seem to have nothing to do with lies. Um, and it's a case where the problems might seem beyond a therapist's ability to help with. The story is so intense. And I often did feel, what can I offer this poor woman that doesn't sound like a platitude, that doesn't sound facile, or is otherwise mostly useless, and certainly not worth the high price of a therapy session. I'm going to call her Jenny, and again, a disclaimer, no names are real that I use in these recordings, and I distort anything biographical that might identify the person, but I don't distort anything that changes the story's substance. Excuse me. Jenny came to see me with a long history, and again, I'm reading off notes, so excuse my eyes going up and down. Long history of depression, anger, episodes of despair, and what most immediately brought her into treatment was indecision about moving forward with a long-term relationship. She obsessed about this last thing for years, and it turned out that these two had been together for over a decade, and she had, in fact, never really felt right about it. But she didn't feel able to stop it, and she always felt that she should be with him. He was a great guy. He certainly sounded like a great guy, and she couldn't really just follow all of her feelings, which were telling her that yes, he's a great guy on paper, but we don't really have the kind of chemistry I want. He doesn't really seem to understand me. Our rhythms, our senses of humor don't really match up, and that became clearer and clearer as we spoke. The fun was really that limited to the kind of weekend college experience that she would share with him and a group of their friends, and that was about it. And even those, as she approached age 30, began to feel, even in memory, a little bit hollow. She remembered being on some of these outings and feeling, I'm not really into this that much. I'm just doing it because that's what you do, and it's better than being alone in my dorm room. Unfortunately, the despair that Jenny harbored that predated this guy was so great that she really couldn't conceive of giving up this one nice thing in her life, annoying as he could be at times, and as lonely as she actually felt with him because of their banter, their ideas, their humor really didn't match up, as I said. But she couldn't make that painful decision to end the relationship. After working with me for a while, she finally did. And after a period of going sort of back and forth, the two of them would sort of reunite briefly and then separate again. Finally, they did separate permanently. Now came the big work. What was the despair? Why was it so difficult for her to simply end a relationship that really had never worked for her? Well, she finally began to realize it was not separating from this nice man or even losing some of this circle of friends. She even began to realize that more than a few of these people were not particularly reliable or even nice. So why had she stayed with them so long? Why had she stayed with that man for so long? Well, as I said in previous posts, it's about the dark matter, what the physicists call dark matter, that makes up 95% of the universe that we don't know anything about, but we know from the evidence has to be there. And I refer you to my other blog entries on the main website. Just go over to the blog and look at the index on the right side of the screen and look for dark matter. There's 2 entries about that. Uh, so, what was her dark matter? Her background, as I mentioned at the beginning, was nothing short of horrific. One parent was mentally ill, another had been murdered. She had grown up with very rejecting relatives who raised her when her parents, one was in prison, one was dead. Uh, the one in prison eventually went to an institution, a mental institution. Um, and in her adult life, the family connections were marginal at best, although she still went to all the family gatherings and had regular contact with her extended family, her siblings, her surviving parent. And if I were to describe, I don't want to take the time here, but if I were to describe to you the tone and the content of these family gatherings, you would quickly be asking the same question I asked her, which was, why do you go? Just skip it. You don't have to go every Sunday. And it was more than once a week that she would attend these things. The only reason for her to keep doing this was this profound basic need we all seem to have for family that's built into us. As I mentioned, during many of our sessions, I struggled with my own feelings of despair. Jenny was very angry, very articulate about how hopeless everything was. And while she was usually quite polite, she was also very bitter about how little I seemed to have to offer her, and how little anybody had to offer her. I sometimes made the mistake of trying to argue with her. She would tell me a story about somebody at work, somebody in her private life, who I would hear had a lot to offer her. And excuse me a second. I would point this out to her, and even if it was in a slightly more limited way than she fantasized, and at moments she would understand that, but then she would quickly fall back into bitterness, and it didn't help. And my mentor, who may be watching this, hi Jerry, I'm sure would disapprove of my having argued with her in that way. I should have waited. Gradually, she began to reveal, and this is what Jerry would have wanted me to wait for, that in fact she actively avoided feeling better. Excuse me. She began telling me about how when she would begin to enjoy herself with her friends or colleagues, or even enjoy and benefit from our work, she would very quickly experience a lot of anxiety, even panic, and she would then, in her own words, pull into myself again, almost fleeing into despair. So one day she described all this in particularly vivid detail, and gradually two keys emerged. And what she ended up saying was that she had the feeling that if she begins to enjoy her life, she's somehow betraying the memory of her dead parent, the horror of what was done to that person, and the other betrayals and outrageous behaviors, past and present, that she witnessed or was a victim of in her family. And two, if she acknowledged all of this, and in particular if she ever dared to confront anybody in her family with this, however gently or politely, she would be ridiculed, scolded, shunned, and most painfully, she would quickly come to believe that her family was right to do that, because of course there's really nothing wrong with any of them. Jenny's just some sort of a difficult, impossible, crazy woman. You might be wondering why I didn't say all of this at the start of our work together. Jenny herself complained about that to me. She said, I must have known that such feelings were operating. Certainly I had read about survivor guilt, and certainly as an experienced therapist, didn't I know that she was fleeing to misery, as people do. It's a kind of resistance, and that's a term you can read about on my website. Well, here was another lie, unconscious, because I showed Jenny some of my notes, and in fact, as she then remembered, I had said those things to her. And again, Jerry is going to disapprove of me having done that. But I did try to say those things to her early on. She wasn't ready to hear them. A quick digression here. This is one of my pet peeves. Psychology always sounds so stupid on Oprah or in other public forums because, put into words, the content of what a patient needs to learn, the content of what we need to see to move forward in our lives, to get over our symptoms and problems, is usually rather simple and fairly obvious to outsiders. Um, of course, you may be thinking many of us have had people in our lives, including in our families, who, when we speak up about something, make us feel like idiots. You know, what's the miracle about that? Especially if we want to say something as dramatic as the emperor is wearing no clothes. Of course, everybody's going to say, "What are you, crazy?" Um, Similarly, Jenny had read about survivor guilt. Um, she was experiencing that and felt that she was abandoning her dead parent if she moved on with her life. She had read about that, seen it in dramatic depictions in television and movies, and plays. But, and it's a big but, when one is going through such things oneself, one can only see those truths when one is ready. I believe that's why it's common in Alcoholics Anonymous, other similar traditions, to say, denial ain't a river in Egypt. I believe that what's meant by that is we can read about denial, you can see it in somebody else who's presenting at a meeting, you can see it in your friends, you can see it in your patients, but when you yourself catch it in yourself, when you go through it yourself, it's astounding. It's as if you never knew what it was, never knew it was real. It's the difference between living something and reading about something. So here's an illustration of a fundamental truth about psychotherapy. 3 fundamental truths, actually. First, the goal is awareness, uncovering what I'm calling the lies. And by the way, take a look at the first chapter of my book called Stop Lying, Getting Unlost and Unstuck in Your Life. You can read half the first chapter for free on Amazon. Excuse me. Sorry. And I'll explain why I use that jarring word, lies. But again, that's the word I'm using. That's one of these 3 truths about therapy that we see in this case, that the goal is to uncover the lies. Second, the process of uncovering lies is going to butt up against resistance, and I talked about that last week with Elaine as well. And therefore, therapy can only move at the pace it can move, because we will aggressively avoid knowing exactly what we need to know. Jenny knew the first year of her relationship with this man that he was wrong for her, nice as he was. She knew it. She knew it then. She even knew it enough to tell me that early in our sessions. And I would simply reflect that back, say, oh, even back then you knew that, and yet, and now you're telling me stories in the present that surely make it sound like this is not the guy for you. And she would completely deny what she had just told me. She'd say, yeah, but he's a great guy, and won't it be wonderful? And that is exactly the kind of life I want, a nice house, a guy like this. We will resist aggressively, adamantly, exactly that which is right in front of our faces. That's 2. And third, uncovering lies has to happen before we can move forward. Other kinds of treatments, other interventions, reading books, self-help books, attending seminars, none of it's going to work until we confront the lies, until we confront the resistance. Again, Jenny had read all about survivor guilt. She had read about resistance. She had read parts of my book as they were developed. She had even read about what one book has called the joy of suffering. She understood this dynamic intellectually of a person being made almost panicky by feeling better and fleeing back into their misery where things are safe and familiar. But it was only when she broke through her own resistance, when her unconscious lies were exposed to her, that she could take any of that learning in and actually learn from it. I don't think I said that well. And actually grow with it, and her symptoms began to go away. What I left out of the story is that subsequently Jenny not only began to feel less despair, but began to actually reach out and take sustenance from the world, from the people who were available to her, including me. Thank you. And there'll be more in future weeks.